The luxury liner Stellar Grace drifted through space like a dying whale, its elegant curves now marred by twisted metal and sparking circuits. Deep in the ship's bowels, the main fusion reactor sputtered and wheezed, throwing off dangerous radiation, bursts that made the hull shimmer with deadly light. Commander Vel pressed his four-fingered hand against the status display, watching the numbers fall with each passing minute. 72 hours of life support remained. Maybe less if the reactor decided to give up completely. The bridge buzzed with controlled panic as officers from 12 different species worked frantically at their stations. The Altarian commanders. Luskin had turned pale purple with stress, a sure sign that even his naturally calm species was reaching its breaking point. Behind him, the navigation officer's tentacles moved in quick, nervous patterns as she calculated their position relative to the nearest help. "Sir, I'm detecting 2 response signals to our general distress beacon," announced Communications Officer Terra, her crystalline form crackling with static electricity. The sound was like breaking glass, which meant she was either excited or terrified. Given their situation, Vel suspected the latter. "Display them on the main screen," Vel ordered, his voice carrying the authority that had kept 847 souls calm during the worst crisis of his 30-year career. The holographic display flickered to life, showing 2 distinct signals moving through the void toward their position. The first signal appeared as a clean blue dot moving at standard Federation speeds. Tara's voice chimed with relief as she read the identification codes. "Federation Rescue, Fleet Gamma 7, sir. 3 heavy cruisers with full medical and engineering support. Estimated arrival time is 74 hours, assuming they maintain. Current velocity." A collective sigh rippled through the bridge crew. 74 hours was cutting it close. But Federation rescue teams were known for their professionalism and advanced medical facilities. They would arrive with everything needed to treat the injured and repair the ship properly. "What about the second signal?" Val asked, though something in his gut already knew he wouldn't like the answer. Tara's crystalline structure dimmed noticeably. "The signal originates from a Terran Republic patrol vessel, designation Iron Will, single ship, modified cargo hauler class. They could reach us in 18 hours, sir." The bridge fell silent except for the ominous humming of failing systems. Every being present knew what those words meant. Humans, Deathworlders, the nightmare species that came from a planet so hostile it had forged them into living weapons. Stories of their brutality, their casual disregard for life, and their ability to survive in conditions that would kill any civilized being had spread throughout the galaxy like a plague. Dr. Nira, the ship's chief medical officer, spoke first. Her voice carried the musical quality of her people, but it trembled with fear. "Commander, surely we can stretch our life support systems. The Keplers are known for their engineering efficiency. Perhaps if we reduced oxygen levels in non-essential areas and moved all passengers to the central decks, we could last another day or 2. Security Chief Rex stepped forward, his massive Proximan frame casting shadows across the navigation console. Unlike the others, his species had actually fought against human forces during the border conflicts 20 years ago. The scars on his armored hide told stories of battles most beings couldn't imagine surviving. "Doctor, with respect, we've already reduced life support to minimum levels. Half the passenger decks are in emergency lockdown due to radiation leaks from the reactor core. We're not lasting another day, let alone 2. "But they're humans," whispered the navigation officer, her tentacles coiling around herself in a defensive posture. "The stories from the vegan mining colonies, the asteroid rebellion, the siege of New Geneva. They don't rescue people, they conquer them." Vel had heard those stories too. Every spacer in the galaxy had. Humans who could breathe poison gas and see in total darkness. Deathworlders who ate radiation for breakfast and punched through steel bulkheads with their bare hands. Monsters who came from a world where everything was trying to kill everything else, and they had somehow made themselves the apex predator. "The Iron Will is broadcasting standard rescue protocols," Tara reported, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're requesting permission to approach and offering immediate assistance." The commander looked around his bridge at the faces of his crew. The Altarians with their normally serene expressions twisted by fear. The delicate crystallines flickering with nervous energy. The gas-based nebulans whose atmospheric suits were already showing stress fractures from the radiation exposure. All of them looking to him for a decision that would determine whether they lived or died. Rex moved closer to the command chair, his heavy footsteps echoing through the bridge. "Commander, I fought humans before. Yes, they're dangerous. Yes, they're unlike anything else in the galaxy. But they follow rules of engagement. They have honor codes. If they're offering rescue, they mean it. How can you be sure?" Dr. Nira asked, her melodic voice now sharp with desperation. The security chief's scarred face twisted into what might have been a smile. "Because if they wanted us dead, we'd already be dead. A human patrol ship doesn't need our permission to do anything. The fact that they're asking means they're here to help." Vel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 847 lives pressing down on his shoulders. The Federation fleet was safe, predictable, civilized. They would arrive with proper medical facilities and follow all the established protocols for rescue operations. They would save everyone according to galactic law and regulation. If there was anyone left to save, the Iron Will could reach them in 18 hours. 18 hours versus 74. The mathematics were simple, even if the implications were terrifying. He thought about the families in the passenger decks, the younglings from 6 different species who had never seen war or violence, all the innocent beings who had boarded his ship expecting nothing more dangerous than a pleasant voyage between star systems. "Open a channel to the Iron Will," he said finally, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. Tara's crystalline form flared with shock. "Sir, are you certain?" "Do it." The communication array crackled to life, sending their coordinates and passenger manifest to the approaching human vessel. Within moments, a response came back in accented but clear galactic standard. "Stellar Grace, this is Captain Tom Bradley of the Iron Will. We've received your distress signal and are proceeding to your location at maximum velocity. Hold tight. Folks, help is on the way." The voice was calm, professional, almost boring in its normalcy. It sounded nothing like the roaring battle cries or mechanical threats that populated the stories about human Deathworlders. It sounded like someone who had done this before many times and found it routine. As the communication ended, Vel realized that he had just made a decision that would either save them all or doom them to a fate worse than the slow death of life. Support failure. Around him, his crew returned to their duties with the grim determination of beings who had run out of options. In 18 hours, they would learn whether the stories about Deathworlders were true. Tom Bradley had been drinking coffee when the distress signal came through, the bitter taste still lingering on his tongue as he studied the emergency transmission. The Iron Will's small bridge hummed with activity as his crew processed the incoming data about the Stellar Grace's situation. Unlike the spacious, elegant bridges of Federation vessels, this was a working ship's command center, all exposed conduits and practical surfaces designed for efficiency rather than comfort. 847 souls on that ship, reported his communications officer, Pete, a former mining engineer whose hands were permanently stained with metal dust. Multiple species, including some I've never heard of. Reactor failure, life support critical, maybe 3 days before things get really bad. Bradley nodded, already running calculations in his head. The Iron Will wasn't built for rescue operations, but it had been his home for 5 years of frontier patrol duty. He knew exactly what his ship could and couldn't do. "Amy, what's our ETA if we push the engines to redline?" Chief Engineer Amy Torres looked up from her console, her dark hair tied back in the practical ponytail she'd worn since her days in the merchant fleet. 18 hours if we're willing to risk a complete engine rebuild afterward. The old girl can take it, but she won't be happy about it. "Do it," Bradley said without hesitation, "and start prepping for a complex rescue operation. We're looking at nearly 1,000 beings from species we might not have full compatibility data for." The bridge crew sprang into action with the practiced efficiency of people who had worked together through asteroid storms, pirate raids, and equipment failures in the galaxy's most dangerous regions. These weren't career military officers with decades of academy training. They were miners, traders, and mechanics who had found themselves serving on the frontier because someone had to, and the regular Navy couldn't spare the ships. Dr. David Kim emerged from the medical bay, his diagnostic tablet already displaying species compatibility charts. I'm pulling everything we have on non-human physiology from the medical database. Good news is I've treated most of these species before during our diplomatic missions. Bad news is some of them require atmospheric conditions that would kill the others instantly. Solutions? Bradley asked, settling into his command chair as the Iron Will's engines roared to life with the kind of power that would terrify most civilian engineers. I'm setting up separate treatment areas with different atmospheric controls. The cargo bay can be converted into a large-scale triage center, and I'm programming the environmental systems to create zones with different gas mixtures and pressure levels. Amy looked up from her engineering station, wiping grease from her hands with a cloth that had seen better days. Captain, I'm reading their technical specifications. The Stellar Grace is a luxury liner built for comfort rather than durability. Their reactor core is the standard Federation design, which means it's efficient but fragile. If we're going to stabilize their systems, I'll need to get inside their engineering sections. Radiation levels? Bradley asked. Lethal to most species. After about 10 minutes of exposure. For us, maybe an hour before we start seeing serious cellular damage. Doable if we work fast and take the proper precautions. Bradley nodded, making mental notes about equipment and personnel assignments. The Iron Will carried a crew of 127 humans, all of them adapted to working in conditions that would hospitalize most galactic citizens within minutes. It wasn't because they were particularly brave or foolish. It was simply because Earth had taught them that the universe was a hostile place, and survival meant learning to function in environments that wanted to kill you. What about the towing operation? Asked Navigation Officer Lisa, her fingers dancing over the holographic controls as she calculated approach vectors and docking procedures. That's going to be the tricky part, Amy admitted, pulling up technical schematics on her display. The Stellar Grace mass is about 20 times what we do. Even with our upgraded engines, we're looking at a slow crawl to the nearest repair facility. How slow? Bradley asked. Maybe a week at safe acceleration levels. Any faster and we risk structural damage to their hull. The captain considered this information while watching the stars blur past the forward viewports as the Iron Will accelerated toward the distress signal. A week of close contact with nearly 1,000 alien beings who had been raised on stories about human brutality and Deathworld savagery. A week of trying to keep them calm while his crew performed what would look like impossibly dangerous repairs and maintenance. Lisa, send a message to Orbital Station Meridian. Let them know we're bringing in a disabled luxury liner with multiple species aboard. They'll need to prepare appropriate facilities. Already on it, sir, she replied, her hands moving efficiently across the communication controls. Pete looked up from his console with a frown. Captain, I'm monitoring chatter from the Stellar Grace. Their crew is pretty spooked about us coming. To help them. Sounds like they've heard some interesting stories about human rescue operations. Bradley suppressed a smile. He could imagine what kinds of stories were circulating among the alien crew. Tales of humans who tore apart starship hulls with their bare hands, who breathed vacuum like atmosphere, who solved engineering problems with violence and stubbornness rather than proper procedure. None of it was entirely false, but context mattered. Can't blame them for being nervous, Dr. Kim commented, looking up from his medical preparations. Most species in the galaxy have never seen humans working in truly dangerous conditions. What looks like reckless disregard for safety to them is just Tuesday afternoon to us. He laughed, a sound that carried across the bridge over the hum of overcharged engines. Remember that diplomatic mission to the Kepler colonies last year? Their engineers nearly fainted when I crawled into that reactor housing to fix the coolant leak. To be fair, Lisa pointed out, the radiation levels in there would have sterilized most species within minutes. Which is why they called us instead of trying to fix it themselves, Bradley said. Sometimes being from a death world means you're the only one crazy enough to solve the problem. The Iron Will shuddered slightly as Amy pushed the engines beyond their normal operating parameters. The ship's hull groaned under the stress, but held together with the stubborn reliability of human engineering. Unlike the elegant curves and artistic designs favored by most galactic civilizations, human ships were built like the tools they were. All angles and reinforced joints designed to function in the worst possible conditions. 17 hours to intercept, Lisa reported. The Stellar Grace is maintaining stable orbit, but their power readings are continuing to drop. Bradley stood up from his command chair, preparing to make his rounds through the ship and check on the rescue preparations. Keep monitoring their communications. If their situation gets worse, push the engines harder. I'd rather rebuild the entire drive system than arrive too late to help. As he walked through the corridors of his ship, Bradley passed crew members, preparing equipment, checking environmental suits, and reviewing technical manuals for alien ship systems they might not have encountered before. These were people who had volunteered for frontier duty, knowing they would be called upon to handle situations that regular fleet personnel couldn't manage. The galaxy saw them as Deathworlders, dangerous beings from a hostile planet who solved problems through brute force and ignorance of proper safety protocols. What the galaxy didn't understand was that humans didn't ignore danger, they simply had a different relationship with it. When you came from a world where everything from the weather to the wildlife was actively trying to kill you, space-based emergencies seemed manageable by comparison. In 17 hours, the Iron Will would reach the Stellar Grace, and Tom Bradley's crew would begin the delicate process of proving that being dangerous and being helpful weren't mutually exclusive concepts. The real challenge wouldn't be fixing the alien ship systems or managing the complex rescue operation. The real challenge would be convincing 847 terrified beings that the monsters coming to save them were actually the good guys. The observation deck of the Stellar Grace had become an impromptu gathering place for passengers brave enough to watch their approaching rescue. Dr. Nira stood among them, her normally steady hands trembling as she watched the human vessel grow larger in the viewport. The Iron Will looked nothing like the sleek Federation ships she was used to seeing. Its hull was scarred with impact marks and radiation burns, angular and practical in a way that suggested it had been built for war rather than exploration. "It looks so small," whispered Mrs. Kalla, an elderly Kepler trader whose family had booked passage to visit relatives in the outer colonies. Her voice carried the musical tones of her species, but fear had made it sharp and discordant. "Small but fast," replied Professor Dex, a scholarly Altarian who taught xenobiology at the University of New Centauri. "Human ships are designed for efficiency rather than comfort. They pack incredible power into compact frames because they expect to operate in hostile environments." Through the reinforced transparent aluminum of the viewport, they could see the Iron Will maneuvering into position alongside their much larger vessel. The human ship moved with mechanical precision, its attitude thrusters firing and controlled bursts that spoke of experienced piloting and well-maintained systems. As it drew closer, details became visible on its hull, weapon mounts, sensor arrays, and what appeared to be mining equipment adapted for space-based operations. "Are those weapons?" asked young Tim, approximate adolescent traveling with his family to the frontier colonies. His species was known for their warrior culture, but even they treated humans with cautious respect. "Probably," Dr. Nira admitted, trying to keep her voice steady for the sake of the younger passengers. "Human ships are designed to operate in dangerous regions where pirate attacks and asteroid collisions are common threats." The docking procedure began with mechanical sounds echoing through the Stellar Grace's hull. Magnetic clamps engaged with solid thunks that reverberated through the ship's superstructure, followed by the hiss of atmospheric seals engaging. The sounds were different from Federation docking procedures, more forceful and direct, lacking the gentle precision that civilized species preferred. Commander Vell's voice echoed through the ship's intercom system, his words carefully chosen to avoid panic. "All passengers and crew, Please remain in designated safe areas while our rescue team comes aboard. They will be conducting emergency repairs and may need to access areas throughout the ship. Dr. Nira had positioned herself near the main passenger airlock where she could observe the humans' arrival and provide medical assistance if needed. Around her, dozens of beings from various species had gathered, their natural curiosity overcoming their fear. The anticipation was almost unbearable as they waited for their first glimpse of the legendary Deathworlders. The airlock cycled with a soft chime, and the inner door slid open to reveal three figures in practical work clothes. Dr. Nira had expected. Monsters, beings whose very appearance would justify the terror their species inspired across the galaxy. Instead, she saw relatively small bipeds who looked almost disappointingly normal. Their leader, presumably the captain, stood barely taller than most Altarians and wore a simple blue jumpsuit with captain's insignia. "Good afternoon, folks," the human said, his voice carrying a pleasant accent that Dr. Nira couldn't identify. "I'm Captain Tom Bradley, and this is Chief Engineer Amy Torres and Dr. David Kim. We're here to get you fixed up and safely to port." The casual tone was perhaps more unsettling than roaring threats would have been. These beings had traveled through space at speeds that would tear apart most ships, performed complex docking maneuvers in the gravity well of a dying reactor, and now spoke as if they were discussing routine maintenance rather than a life or death. Rescue Operation. Commander Vell approached the human captain with the formal dignity expected of a luxury liner's commanding officer. "Captain Bradley, welcome aboard the Stellar Grace. I must warn you that our reactor core is highly unstable and radiation levels throughout the engineering sections have reached dangerous levels." Bradley nodded, pulling a small device from his pocket and checking its readings. "Yeah, we're reading about 15 rads per hour in the forward sections, climbing toward 30 near the reactor core. Manageable, but we'll want to work quickly." The casual way he discussed radiation levels that would kill most beings within hours sent a chill through the assembled passengers. Dr. Nira watched as the human engineer, Amy Torres, consulted a tablet and began discussing technical specifications with Commander Vell's chief engineer. Her manner was professional and competent, but she spoke about entering radioactive compartments the way most people discussed taking a walk in the park. "Dr. Kim," Dr. Nira found herself saying, stepping forward, before she could reconsider. "I'm Dr. Nira, Chief Medical Officer. If you need assistance with treating our wounded, I have full medical files for all species aboard." The human doctor smiled, and Dr. Nira was surprised by how genuine it appeared. "That would be incredibly helpful, Dr. Nira. I've treated most of your species before, but having current medical records will make everything go much smoother." As they spoke, more humans began arriving through the airlock, carrying equipment and tools that looked somehow both primitive and advanced. Their movements were efficient and purposeful, lacking the careful deliberation that most species employed when working in dangerous conditions. They split into teams without apparent discussion, some heading toward the engineering sections while others began setting up what appeared to be medical equipment in the passenger areas. "They're so casual about it," whispered Professor Dex to a small group of passengers watching the operation. "Look at how they move through areas our own crew marked as hazardous. It's like they don't understand the danger." Dr. Nira was beginning to suspect that the humans understood the danger perfectly. Well, they simply had a different definition of what constituted an acceptable risk. She watched as Dr. Kim began setting up medical stations with practiced efficiency, his hands moving quickly but carefully as he arranged equipment designed to treat multiple species with conflicting physiological requirements. "Dr. Nira," the human doctor said, looking up from his work, "I'm going to need to check on some of your more seriously injured passengers. Our medical sensors indicate several beings with radiation poisoning and impact injuries from when your ship lost artificial gravity." She nodded, leading him toward the medical bay where her most critical patients were housed. As they walked through the corridors, she noticed how the human moved through areas where radiation warnings flashed red, apparently unconcerned by exposure levels that had forced her to limit her own time in these sections. "Doesn't the radiation concern you?" she asked, unable to contain her curiosity. Dr. Kim glanced at the dosimeter on his belt and shrugged. We're getting maybe 25 rads per hour in this section. Uncomfortable for extended exposure, but manageable for the time we need to work. My species evolved on a planet with a damaged ozone layer and high background radiation. We're pretty resistant to this kind of exposure. The casual admission that humans lived on a world so hostile it had damaged the very atmosphere was somehow more terrifying than any of the stories about their violence or aggression. Dr. Nira began to understand that the humans weren't ignoring the dangers aboard the Stellar Grace. They were simply operating within parameters that would be fatal to most other species. In the medical bay, she watched as Dr. Kim examined her patients with gentle competence, his hands steady as he worked with beings whose physiology was completely unlike his own. He treated an injured crystalline whose body structure was so delicate that most doctors needed special equipment just to touch them safely. He administered medication to gaseous beings whose atmospheric requirements were toxic to most solid matter species, apparently unaffected by their poisonous exhalations. How is this possible? Dr. Nira asked as she watched him work. Practice, Dr. Kim replied simply. When you work the frontier regions, you encounter every species in the galaxy eventually. You learn to adapt your techniques or people die. It's that simple. As the rescue operation continued around them, Dr. Nira began to realize that her preconceptions about Deathworlders had been fundamentally wrong. The humans weren't dangerous because they brought destruction with them. They were dangerous because they came from a world so hostile that they had learned to function in conditions that would kill anyone else. And right now, that made them the only people in the galaxy capable of saving everyone aboard the Stellar Grace. Amy Torres had been crawling through the Stellar Grace's reactor housing for 2 hours when the first tow cable snapped. The sound echoed through both ships like a gunshot, followed by the groaning of stressed metal as the Iron Will's engines struggled to maintain their grip on the massive luxury liner. Through her earpiece, she heard Captain Bradley's calm voice reporting the situation to both crews. Cable failure on the primary attachment point. We're holding position on the secondary cables, but they won't take this kind of stress for long. Amy wiped sweat from her forehead, leaving a streak of grease across her skin as she considered their options. The reactor core around her hummed with barely contained energy, its radiation output climbing steadily as the containment systems continued to fail. Her dosimeter had been clicking steadily for the past hour, indicating exposure levels that would have killed most of the Stellar Grace's crew within minutes. Captain, I need another 30 minutes to stabilize this reactor, she reported, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. If we lose main power now, we'll have cascading failures throughout both ships. Understood. Do what you need to do. Through the hull, Amy could feel the vibrations as her crewmates began emergency repairs on the tow cable system. The work would have to be done in open space and the radiation field being generated by both ships, damaged systems, and the nearby pulsar that had caused their problems in the first place. It was the kind of job that required someone comfortable working in an environment that was actively trying to kill them. In other words, it was a job for humans. Commander Vell's voice crackled through the ship's communication system, speaking to his passengers in the soothing tones that luxury liner officers were trained to use during emergencies. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some minor technical difficulties with our tow configuration. Please remain calm while our rescue team makes the necessary adjustments. Amy almost smiled at the diplomatic language. Minor technical difficulties was certainly one way to describe the fact that they were drifting in a radiation field strong enough to sterilize planets, held together by cables that were failing one by one under gravitational stresses that no engineer had ever designed for. Her portable scanner beeped as she located the primary cause of the reactor instability. A coolant coupling had been damaged during the initial crisis, causing a cascade of system failures that were slowly building toward a complete meltdown. The repair required getting her hands into spaces that were tight even for someone of her relatively small size. working with tools and temperatures that fluctuated between freezing and scalding, depending on which system was cycling at any given moment. "Dr. Kim, how are our patients holding up?" She heard Captain Bradley ask over the communication channel. "Stable for now, but I've got 17 beings with radiation exposure symptoms. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but they need proper medical facilities soon." Amy redoubled her efforts, knowing that every minute they spent in this radiation field was another minute of exposure for beings whose species had never evolved the resistance that humans took for granted. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she rerouted power conduits and replaced damaged components with spare parts from the Iron Will's engineering stores. The work was dangerous, requiring her to reach into systems that were still operating at full power while radiation levels climbed steadily around her. The danger was relative. Compared to the mining operations she had worked in the asteroid belts, or the reactor maintenance she had performed on colony ships in uncharted systems, this was just another day at the office. Through the hull, she could hear the sound of magnetic boots on metal as her crewmates worked to install new tow cables. The external vehicular activity team was led by Pete Morrison, a former asteroid miner who had spent more time in spacesuits than most people spent in their own clothes. The radiation levels outside the ship would cook most beings instantly, but Pete and his team moved through the environment with the casual competence of people who had learned to work in conditions that existed nowhere else in the galaxy except around human operations. "New cables are in place," Pete reported, his voice carrying the slight breathlessness that came from working in a spacesuit for extended periods. "We're seeing some gravitational stress from that pulsar, but the new attachment points should hold." Amy finished her work on the reactor core just as her dosimeter began emitting the rapid beeping that indicated dangerous exposure levels. She had maybe 10 more minutes before radiation sickness became a serious concern, even for someone with her species' natural resistance. Time enough to finish the essential repairs and get back to areas where the shielding was more effective. As she crawled back through the maintenance tunnels, Amy could hear conversations from the passenger areas where Dr. Kim was treating the most seriously affected beings. The voices were a mixture of musical tones, harmonic vibrations, and atmospheric disturbances that represented 12 different species, all trying to understand what was happening to them. "The human doctor moves through areas that should kill him," she heard one passenger say in accented galactic standard. "He treated Mrs. Zara in the radiation isolation ward without even wearing protective equipment." "Their engineer has been inside the reactor core for hours," another voice added. "Our own engineering staff said those areas were uninhabitable." Amy emerged from the maintenance tunnel to find a small group of alien passengers watching her with expressions that mixed fascination with terror. Her jumpsuit was stained with coolant. Her exposed skin showed the slight reddening that indicated radiation exposure, and her hair was plastered to her head with sweat. She probably looked exactly like the kind of dangerous Deathworlder that populated their nightmares. "Reactor's stable," she announced to Captain Bradley over her communicator. "We should have enough power to maintain life support and basic systems until we reach port." One of the passengers, an elderly Kepler whose crystalline structure was flickering with nervous energy, stepped forward hesitantly. "Young woman, are you injured? You appear to have been exposed to dangerous levels of radiation." Amy looked down at her reddened skin and shrugged. "Nothing serious. I'll be fine in a day or two once my system processes the exposure. My species has pretty good natural repair mechanisms for this kind of damage." A casual admission that she had deliberately exposed herself to radiation levels that would be fatal to most species, and expected to recover naturally, sent a visible shudder through the assembled aliens. Amy realized that her matter-of-fact attitude toward mortal danger was probably more unsettling than dramatic displays of toughness would have been. "The important thing is that your ship is stable," she continued, trying to sound reassuring. "We'll have you safely docked at Orbital Station Meridian within the week." As she headed toward the Iron Will to check on the tow cable repairs, Amy passed through the passenger areas where her crewmates were helping with evacuation procedures and medical treatment. The scene was surreal, humans moving casually through areas marked with radiation warnings and atmospheric hazard signs, working alongside alien crew members, who could only enter the same spaces wearing full environmental protection, the passengers. Watched these interactions with growing amazement. They had expected monsters, beings whose reputation for violence and destruction was matched by their appearance. Instead, they saw competent professionals who happened to be capable of surviving in conditions that would kill anyone else. Dr. Kim looked up from treating a young Proximan with radiation burns, his hands steady as he administered medication, designed for a species whose biochemistry was completely unlike his own. Amy, how long until we're clear of this radiation field? 6 hours at current velocity, she replied, checking her scanner readings. The pulsar's output is actually decreasing, so exposure levels should drop steadily as we move away. She didn't mention that decreasing radiation levels would still be lethal to most species for several more days. There was no point in frightening people with information they couldn't use. The humans would continue working in whatever conditions existed, and the alien passengers would remain in the shielded areas where they could survive. It was, Amy reflected, a perfect example of why humans had ended up as the galaxy's emergency responders. Not because they sought out danger or enjoyed violence, but because they came from a world so hostile that they could function normally in conditions that represented mortal peril to everyone else. As the Iron Will resumed towing the Stellar Grace toward safety, Amy began planning the maintenance work that would be needed once they reached port. It would be routine work compared to what they had just accomplished, but she knew that the alien passengers would remember this rescue for the rest of their lives. They had learned that Deathworlders weren't the monsters of their nightmares. They were the people you called when monsters weren't scary enough to solve the problem. The docking bay of Orbital Station Meridian buzzed with activity as the Iron Will guided the Stellar Grace into the massive repair facility. News of the rescue had spread throughout the station's diverse population, and beings from dozens of species had gathered to witness the arrival of nearly 1,000 survivors who had been saved by the galaxy's most feared Deathworlders. Dr. Nira stood at the observation window of the passenger lounge, watching as the station's docking arms extended to secure both vessels. After 6 days of travel through space, seeing the familiar lights and orderly structure of a major orbital facility felt like awakening from a nightmare. Around her, fellow passengers pressed against the windows, many of them speaking in hushed tones about their experiences during the rescue operation. "I still can't believe they saved us," whispered Mrs. Calla, the elderly Kepler trader whose family had been among the most frightened when the humans first arrived. "All those stories we heard about Deathworlders, and they turned out to be the gentlest rescuers imaginable." Professor Dex nodded, his scholarly mind already working to process the implications of what they had witnessed. "I think we've been fundamentally misunderstanding what it means to be a Deathworlder. We assumed it meant they brought death with them. In reality, it means they've learned to function in conditions where death is a constant presence. Through the station's communication system, they could hear the controlled chaos of a major rescue operation. Medical teams were preparing to receive passengers with various forms of radiation exposure. Engineering crews were getting ready to begin repairs on the Stellar Grace's damaged systems. Most importantly, diplomatic officials were already drafting reports about what they were calling the most significant rescue operation in recent galactic history. Commander Vell had spent the journey documenting everything he had witnessed, knowing that his official report would be studied by Federation officials for years to come. The humans had not only saved 847 lives, they had done so with a level of competence and care that challenged every assumption about their species. His crew had watched human engineers work in conditions that should have killed them, seen human doctors treat alien patients with gentle expertise, and observed human officers maintain perfect discipline throughout an operation that would have broken most civilized crews. The docking procedure completed with the mechanical precision that characterized all human operations. Within minutes, station medical personnel were boarding the Stellar Grace to begin the process of transferring patients who needed specialized care. Dr. Nira found herself working alongside the station's medical team, helping to coordinate treatment for beings whose exposure to radiation and stress had pushed their physiologies beyond normal limits. Dr. Nira called Dr. Kim as he prepared to transfer his equipment back to the Iron Will. "It's been an honor working with you. Your medical expertise made this operation much smoother than it could have been." She looked at the human doctor who had spent 6 days treating patients in conditions that should have killed him, maintaining perfect bedside manner while working in radiation fields that forced her own species to use remote diagnostic equipment. "Dr. Kim, I must ask you something that's been troubling me since this began. How do you do it? How do you function normally in conditions that would be immediately fatal to most species?" Dr. Kim paused in his packing, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I suppose it comes down to perspective, Dr. Nira. Earth taught us that the universe is inherently hostile. Radiation, temperature extremes, atmospheric toxins, gravitational stress, these are just environmental factors we learn to account for. We don't see them as insurmountable obstacles, just challenges that require appropriate responses." "But the risks," she protested. "The exposure levels, the physical demands, the potential for catastrophic failure. How do you accept such dangers as routine?" "Because the alternative is letting people die when we could have saved them," Dr. Kim replied simply. "Our world made us capable of working in these conditions. That capability comes with responsibility." The conversation was interrupted by an announcement over the station's communication system. "All passengers and crew of the Stellar Grace, please report to Conference Hall Alpha for debriefing and processing. Transportation to your final destinations will be arranged through the station administration." As the passengers began moving toward the debriefing areas, Dr. Nira noticed how many of them stopped to speak with members of the Iron Will's crew. The same beings who had been terrified by the prospect of human rescue were now expressing gratitude to the people who had saved their lives. Children from multiple species clustered around Amy Torres, asking questions about her work in the reactor core. Elderly passengers sought out Captain Bradley to thank him for his crew's professionalism and care. The debriefing session became an impromptu celebration as passenger after passenger recounted their experiences during the rescue. Professor Dex had already begun drafting academic papers about human capabilities in extreme environments. The Proximate Security Chief Rex was recommending changes to Federation emergency protocols based on what he had observed of human rescue techniques. Even the most cautious passengers were reconsidering their assumptions about Deathworld species. "Ladies and gentlemen," Commander Vell announced as the formal debriefing concluded, "I want to personally thank Captain Bradley and the crew of the Iron Will for their extraordinary service. They have demonstrated that the term Deathworlder says more about capability than character, and I will be recommending to Federation Command that human vessels be included in all future emergency response protocols." The announcement drew applause from the assembled passengers, but Captain Bradley seemed almost embarrassed by the attention. "We just did what anyone would do when they received a distress call," he said simply. "It's part of the job." As the passengers began dispersing to continue their journeys, Dr. Nira found herself thinking about the implications of what they had experienced. The rescue of the Stellar Grace would become a case study in interspecies cooperation, but more importantly, it would change how the galaxy viewed humanity. The stories that emerged from this incident would spread through trade networks and diplomatic channels, carrying a new understanding of what Deathworlders really represented. 3 weeks later, Dr. Nira was back at her home medical facility on Kepler Prime when she received an emergency communication from the Galactic Medical Council. A research station in the Vega system had suffered a reactor breach and was requesting immediate assistance. The station housed representatives from 18 different species, and the environmental conditions following the accident were beyond the survival capabilities of most rescue teams. "Dr. Nira," the council representative explained, "we're assembling a joint rescue operation with multiple species contributing their specialized capabilities. Given your recent experience working with human medical personnel, we'd like you to serve as liaison with the Terran Republic rescue team." She accepted without hesitation, already looking forward to working again with people who treated impossible conditions as merely challenging ones. As she prepared for the mission, Dr. Nira reflected on how much her perspective had changed since the Stellar Grace incident. She no longer saw humans as dangerous Deathworlders to be avoided, but as invaluable allies who could function where others could not. The galaxy was slowly learning what the passengers of the Stellar Grace had discovered during their rescue. You don't send an SOS to Deathworlders because they're dangerous. You send an SOS to Deathworlders because when everything else fails, when the environment itself is trying to kill you, when conventional solutions aren't enough, dangerous is exactly what you need. The Iron Will had already departed Orbital Station Meridian, resuming its patrol of the frontier sectors where human crews served as the galaxy's first responders to impossible situations. Captain Bradley and his crew continued their routine work, unaware that they had fundamentally changed how an entire galaxy viewed their species. In the months that followed, similar stories began emerging from across human space. Mining accidents where human rescue teams saved trapped workers from a dozen different species. Diplomatic emergencies where human negotiators worked in environments that would kill most ambassadors. Scientific expeditions where human researchers enabled discoveries that would have been impossible for other species to achieve. The galaxy was discovering that Earth's children weren't the monsters of their nightmares. They were the guardians forged by a world so hostile that they could save anyone, anywhere, from anything. And as this understanding spread through interstellar civilization, the phrase, "Why don't you send an SOS to Deathworlders?" began to change its meaning entirely. The answer was no longer about fear or caution. The answer was becoming clear to everyone who had ever found themselves in a situation where survival seemed impossible. You do send an SOS to Deathworlders, because sometimes they're the only ones who can answer.